Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. I'm Charles White, and with a colleague, Jamie Nibbs, we'll be hosting this evening's talk and Q&A. Before we get underway, there are a few housekeeping points to highlight. The talk and responses to questions raised will represent the views of either the speaker or McInroy and Wood. Discussions of specific industry sectors or companies will not constitute advice or recommendations. Thank you to those who have submitted questions already. If you have not, you can do so during the talk using the Q&A facility on your screen. All questions will be kept anonymous. We've allowed about 40 minutes for Q&A and hope this will be enough time to address all the questions raised. If we do not manage to cover all questions, you are welcome to email Professor Allen after the event. We'll be recording this evening's talk, and the recording will be available to replay via our website. So now to the talk. The seriousness of climate change and the threat it poses is not in doubt. Later this year, progress in achieving Paris Agreement commitments will be assessed at COP26 in Glasgow. Against this backdrop, we are very privileged to be joined by Professor Myles Allen, who will be presenting his views on whether enough is being done to achieve net zero by 2050. Professor Allen has been at the forefront of academic research into climate change and has served on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Myles, welcome, and over to you. I think you'll start sharing your screen now.
Hello, yes, well, thank you very much. And I'm just getting my video going, so hopefully you can see me all right. Thank you very much for the invitation, Charles. Yes, I'm very happy to share with you some ideas, and I'm hopefully looking forward to your questions on achieving net zero, on the sort of the challenge of getting there. Can I just confirm to Charles that you're seeing my screen okay? And I'll just put it into slideshow mode. Is that now working?
We can see that, Myles. Thank you.
Excellent, great. So yeah, so I'm Myles Allen. I'm a physicist by background, although I now straddle two departments, School of Geography and the Environment and Department of Physics at the University of Oxford. And I want to talk to you, I'm particularly speaking to you as director of the new Oxford Net Zero Initiative. The university is putting a lot of resources, its own resources, into helping the world in this enterprise that we're all embarked on. I have the privilege of directing the Oxford Net Zero Initiative, which kicked off just this year. And the sort of straight away, I want to give you an image to remember. And I think this is an extremely striking one, and it contains a very profound message for us all. And the message is, we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. And it may seem an incredibly obvious point, but it's one that has some profound implications. And the reason I believe this is true, I mean, I might put a qualifier as a scientist, I might say we probably need to stop fossil fuels, but you know, we can leave out those little niceties for now, for the sake of simplicity and getting a good soundbite. But this image, I think, illustrates the extraordinary power of fossil fuels. This was a village in Greece, and then they discovered their village was built on a lignite deposit, a particularly high carbon form of brown coal. And they literally dug out the ground underneath their houses, leaving only the church standing in order to get at that lignite. And I think this tells you, and if anybody tells you that we're just going to move on from using fossil fuels, that we're just going to make renewable energy cheap enough that we just won't bother to use fossil fuels again in time to meet our climate goals. And that's a very important point. I mean, one day we will stop using fossil fuels. I've no doubt in 2400 we would no longer be using fossil fuels if we're still around then. But the point, and what this illustration shows, is that no conceivable carbon price, other, I suppose, than the threat of eternal damnation, would be high enough to stop people using fossil fuels in time to meet our climate goals. So we have to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. So how do we do it? And this is illustrated by our Oxford Net Zero logo, which shows these schematic pathways to net zero. First of all, on the left, there's the stuff we're putting in the atmosphere. And if we want to stop global warming, we need to stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, period. That's a very simple piece of science, emerged over the past 15 years or so, and it's incontrovertible. Everybody agrees that the carbon dioxide is a cumulative climate pollutant. The more carbon dioxide you dump in the atmosphere, the higher the temperatures go. The only way to stop global warming is to stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it's the cumulative emissions that matter. It's the total amount you dump to the time you reach net zero. So if we delay, the little arrows there showing, if we delay starting reductions, we're just going to have to get down faster and further later on if we're going to meet any particular climate goal. And that's illustrated by this, one of the iconic figures from the recent, 5 years ago now, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which shows there's a pretty straightforward, straight line relationship between carbon dioxide, total carbon dioxide dumped in the atmosphere in the horizontal, and the warming you get in the vertical. So the more you put in, the warmer it gets. And the only way to stop it warming is to stop putting it in, which is, but of course, it doesn't necessarily mean stopping generating carbon dioxide. And one important realization that many scientists and companies indeed have come to is that we probably can't get our production of carbon dioxide down fast enough. So we can reduce emissions, but we probably can't reduce them fast enough to meet our climate goals. And so it's very important to complement our emission reductions with what are called nature-based climate solutions, planting trees, restoring ecosystems, certainly arresting deforestation, in order to take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and store it in the biosphere. And this is a very important complement to emission reductions. It's not a replacement for emission reductions, but it helps to bring the net amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere down faster than we can probably manage to do so by just cutting the activities that generate carbon dioxide on their own. But it's very important to keep this opportunity, important though it is, in perspective. And I'm now going to share with you a figure. Please don't tweet this because it's embargoed until tomorrow, I believe. It's embargoed until Thursday morning. This is in this week's issue of Nature, and it's a paper showing the impact of nature-based climate solutions. What we might argue is the maximal impact. It's a very optimistic estimate of what nature-based solutions can deliver in terms of future temperature. And the crucial conclusion of this paper, as illustrated by the long game, nature takes time to have an impact. So if we're talking about ambitious climate goals, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or as close as we can to 1.5 degrees, we're going to reach those temperatures by mid-century, even if we start reducing emissions now. So there's a limit to the amount of warming that nature can save. And there's another really important, don't count on nature solving the entire problem. And even more importantly, this is a rather technical looking slide, but it shows a very important point. As the world warms, that arrow, which is the release, or well, if it was above the line, it would be the uptake, and unfortunately it's below the line, it's the release of carbon dioxide from the biosphere back into the atmosphere. And as the world warms, we see, even 5 years ago, we were expressing concerns that the biosphere would start to release carbon back into the atmosphere. And indeed, now these concerns are getting even more accentuated because people are starting to see changes occurring in permafrost regions and so on, which, there's clearly a strong risk that global warming itself will cause the biosphere that's, plants, soils, and so on, to release carbon back into the atmosphere. So we can't count on this as a permanent solution. When Shell encourages you to drive carbon neutral by protecting and replanting forests, there's a very temporary sense in which that's not entirely misleading, but you've got to, you need to accept, Shell needs to accept, Shell's investors need to accept that this cannot be relied on as a solution, a sustainable solution to continued use of fossil fuels indefinitely, certainly not past the middle of this century. And so I'd love to know what Shell's plans are for when, the biosphere offset option runs out. In the end, stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming means a massive scale up of permanent carbon dioxide storage. What we need to get to is a situation where the amount of carbon dioxide we're generating from burning fossil fuels is exactly balanced by permanent disposal of carbon dioxide back underground. So this figure shows you a representative, it's actually the average of the 1.5 degree scenarios in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So I'm sure you've seen all these many times. I'm sure you've seen the emissions coming down very rapidly to reach net zero sometime around mid-century, on average, sort of in the 2050s or so. These are emissions, by the way, from energy and industry. I've left, just for the sake of simplicity, I've left out land use change emissions from this figure. But what people don't often realize is the total amount of carbon dioxide we produce in these scenarios by burning fossil fuels. And these scenarios are not entirely made up. They are, projections of the way the world economy will evolve if we're going to meet our climate goals. The total amount of carbon dioxide we produce only goes down by about 2/3. And the reason we get to zero is because we have a massive scale up in the amount of carbon dioxide we store back underground. So there's two sides to getting to net zero. We have to burn less, reduce the total amount of carbon dioxide we're producing, and we also have to store more. And burning less means replacing fossil fuels with the likes of renewable energy, wind and solar and so on. Storing more, permanent storage at the moment, means re-injecting carbon dioxide back underground. That's the only available scalable solution for permanent storage of carbon dioxide, so we can guarantee that it'll stay out of the atmosphere on the kind of timescales we need it to stay out of the atmosphere to solve the climate problem. And that, I like this schematic because it illustrates the scales involved. It is essentially the same technology that we use for getting natural gas out of the Earth's crust in the first place, but just with the gas going in reverse. What you do is you capture the carbon dioxide, you compress it until it actually forms a liquid, and then you re-inject that liquid so deep into the Earth's crust that it's under such pressure that it remains a liquid down there and is stored in much the same rock formations that we find hydrocarbons in the first place. So it's kind of a sort of, not exactly circular, but a sort of U-shaped use of carbon dioxide. So we know that carbon dioxide can be stored in subsurface rock formations for millions of years, because very often when the industry is drilling for natural gas, for example, they find carbon dioxide, which has been, it's fossil carbon dioxide. And then, of course, there's great disappointment because that's not what they were looking for. But you know, it shows that these subsurface storage sites can be secure under the right rock formations. But there are challenges to this. It's expensive. Getting rid of carbon dioxide permanently by re-injecting it back into the Earth's crust costs a lot of money. At the moment, there are companies that will actually do this for you, but they'll charge you hundreds of dollars per ton of carbon dioxide disposed of. You know, they say that at scale, they should be able to get that cost down to around $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. But in the meantime, there are many much cheaper ways of reducing emissions. And this is a figure from Goldman Sachs, actually, but it illustrates the point. The horizontal axis here is reductions in emissions, and we need to get to around well, depending obviously on what year you're talking about, you need to get to around 60 or so on this curve. Well up into the 50s. So you can see that measures to reduce the production of carbon dioxide, those burn less options in this figure, they start off consistently cheaper than measures to increase the storage of carbon dioxide until we're almost sort of 75% of the way there. So if we just do what we do at the moment, which is to rely on, you know, emission trading systems or carbon pricing or something to drive down emissions, nobody's going to invest in carbon dioxide storage until basically it's too late, because we can eliminate, you know, 3/4 of our emissions with very little use of storage, but then you hit the wall. Then you get to the very high value, very difficult to decarbonize activities that are going to cost a fortune to get rid of those carbon dioxide sources into the atmosphere. Things like aviation. We've got no alternative to generating carbon dioxide in aviation. We've steel production at the moment, although there are ideas out there for producing steel with hydrogen, it's still not clear if that's going to be a viable option in the long term. There's cement production is another input. So mostly these are not actually the things you typically associate with carbon dioxide and global warming. These are sort of more niche industrial activities, but they make up a substantial fraction of our emissions, and they're at the moment impossible to decarbonize and likely to remain so for the indefinite future. So those ones we will have no option but to compensate for them by taking carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and sticking it back underground, which is, you know, introduces an idea that we've been promoting here in Oxford for some years now, which is that we should encourage producers of fossil fuels, suppliers, producers or importers of fossil fuels, to start getting rid of the carbon dioxide generated by the products they sell. Because we know that one day we're going to need them to get rid of it all, or somebody will have to get rid of it all. At the moment, the plan is that the taxpayer will get rid of it all. But we kind of know where that ends. If you have a privatized profits and socialized risks, you end up with very inefficient outcomes. We've been through that in the past, and we don't seem to have learned our lessons, because at the moment, although governments around the world are acknowledging the need for disposing of carbon dioxide, for getting rid of carbon dioxide, they're not really, they're just paying for it. The taxpayers ending up paying for it, which isn't viable. It's going to be far too expensive an activity to rely on the taxpayer, particularly in these days when there's been an awful lot of demands on the taxpayer recently. To expect the taxpayer to clean up after a still very profitable industry seems completely unrealistic. So what we need to do is to require the industry to start disposing of the carbon dioxide generated by the products they sell. And if you think of the problem in this way, it suddenly turns out to look remarkably tractable. So here's an illustration, those emission curves going down, just focus on the dark blue ones. Those are the ones that sort of reach 1.5 degrees. And if you, on the right, instead of plotting emissions into the atmosphere, I'm showing you the fraction of carbon dioxide that's generated by our use of fossil fuels that is dumped into the atmosphere, that is not dumped into the atmosphere, that is captured and re-injected back underground. So that fraction has to go to 100% if we're to achieve net zero. That's what net zero means. It means an exact balance between the amount of carbon dioxide you produce from burning fossil fuels and the amount of carbon dioxide you dispose of safely back underground. So you can see they all go up following pretty much the same pathway, exactly as you'd expect, because that's what it takes. We're currently at 0. Well, we're at 0.1% on this sequestered fraction. It needs to get to 100%, so it needs to go up by a factor of 1,000. in the space of 30 years. And the red line is just, okay, what if we just said, get on with it? Tell the industry to get on with disposing of carbon dioxide, 10% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 100% by 2050, problem solved. That's the end of global warming. We've stopped fossil fuels from causing global warming. It is doable. If the industry were required to do this, they would absolutely just get on with it. But we're just not even asking them to try at the moment. Norway, to their credit, slightly by accident, may be sort of more or less on target by 2030 for achieving net zero in their own emissions, which of course aren't that high, by 2030. The UK, despite many announcements in this area from our government, will be lucky to be at 2%. We're probably more like closer to 1%. And, you know, we'll be at 1% in 2030 with aspirations to get to 100% by 2050. It just doesn't stack up. Just to finish up, because people often worry that, you know, this kind of carbon dioxide disposal will be horrendously expensive. It's not. Just to reassure you with some numbers here, because you don't need to dispose of all of the carbon dioxide generated by the fossil fuels we sell and use straight away. The cost isn't, you know, prohibitive immediately. You start at the bottom, work up to 100%. By the time you get to 100% CO2 disposal, this would add quite a lot to the cost of using fossil fuels. It would add, you know, $250 per ton of CO2, or $100 to the price of a barrel of oil, or 50 pence to the cost of a litre of petrol. If you think about 50 pence on the cost of a litre of petrol to completely stop global warming, why aren't we talking about this more? We nearly did. Back in 2015, there was a amendment introduced to the energy bill. No one really noticed. Within 1 year of this act coming into force, the Secretary of State shall undertake measures to require extractors and importers of petroleum to contribute to the development of carbon capture and storage. If that had gone through, it would have completely transformed the landscape around addressing climate change, because suddenly climate change would no longer have been an issue of, you know, nagging consumers to change their behavior. It would have been a very straightforward issue of regulating one industry to dispose of its waste. And that's the way we should be thinking about this problem. Nagging consumers is not going to work. The institution in the world, there is only one institution in the world that has the capacity, the cash flow, the access to capital, the engineering capabilities to solve climate change, and that is the fossil fuel industry. And we have to get on with getting them going on doing it. They can't do it on their own. They need pressure from their investors, from their owners, and from governments to put them onto a sustainable path. So as investors, these are the questions we think you should be asking the companies you own. First and foremost, do they get it? Have they made a commitment to net zero? Do they understand what net zero means? And do their actions sort of stack up to that? They may say they've got a net zero commitment, but then they're sort of quietly funding anti-climate science lobbying in the background or whatever. So you know, ask first that question. Have they made that commitment? Equally important, particularly for you as investors, have they got a profitable net zero strategy? Have they come up with a business model that will work in a net zero world and doesn't rely on some taxpayer bailout or you know, somebody else cleaning up after them, or rely on vast use of forests without, you know, a very clear idea about where those forests are, to dispose of the carbon dioxide generated by their products? And of course, you know, as investors, you should be asking them, what are the medium-term milestones? You know, how are you actually going to check that they're on target for doing this? So these are the questions we think you should be asking the companies you own. It's the questions the University of Oxford is asking the companies we own, who are engaged in any activity that is likely to affect the Earth's climate, but particularly companies involved in extractive, in fossil fuel extraction. So I'm hoping that's given you some ideas, thoughts, and very much looking forward to your questions.
Myles, there we go. Sorry, just go my video. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I think the first question that we might kick off with, just picking up your last point about the questions that investors can pose to companies, and one of those being quantitative medium-term targets. And there is I picked up from some of the things you said that perhaps this focus on, it may not be medium-term, but at least near-term targets and commitments may have detracted from that focus on achieving the ultimate goal by 2050. And so our obsession with carbon trading and offset schemes in the short term may be distracting from actually coordinated efforts to achieving 2050.
Absolutely. And I would absolutely not want to undermine the case for investing in nature. And there's a lot of benefits to that if it's done well. But it's really important that a company that's making investments, that's investing in plants or in fossil fuel exploration or whatever, has a plan for what's going to happen to that carbon dioxide that isn't just, oh, we're going to plant some trees and it'll all be fine. Because, if you just add up the numbers, I think Shell's, just Shell's own, I picked up on Shell because they publish a lot of numbers, but other fossil fuel companies are available. But if you just take their emissions and calculate the forest resources you would need to compensate for the CO2 generated by the emissions of just that one company, it's everything. It's all of the forest resources we are likely to have available in 2050. So, yes, they can say, well, we're going to do this, but not all of the companies you own can have the same plan because they're all on the same planet. So yes, we need these long-term strategies.
Just picking up on that a little bit further, Myles, we have had a few questions around forestry, and I think you've made your point quite clearly that in isolation it won't be sufficient to get us to net zero. But are you also considering in that assessment, the potential of soils through improved farming practices, and the potential of coastal ecosystems? There've been I think some press recently about the potential of seaweeds, for example. So is this an all-encompassing assessment of the potential of the biosphere that you're considering here? I'm
a global modeler. So what I'm looking at is the biosphere as a whole globally. And, as I showed you that one figure, but there's plenty of others like it, which shows as the world warms, the biosphere as a whole, on average, the sinks that we rely on in the biosphere to take up carbon weaken and start to release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So you can't count on the biosphere mopping up the carbon we generate from fossil fuels. And we're going to need it for other things. We're going to need it to grow food. So I think if companies want to invest in biospheric storage now, that's great. There's lots of it. If it's done well, there's massive benefits both to biodiversity and short-term carbon storage and so on as well. So I absolutely don't want to discourage anyone from doing that. But they have to have a plan to deal with the contingency that resource is no longer available in 20 years' time. And that's what I'm missing from these company plans. I don't see the contingency plan. We're going to plant trees to offset our emissions now, but when we can't do that anymore, we're going to do X. And that's the bit that's missing for me. Because, crucially, scaling up, injecting carbon dioxide into the Earth's crust is going to take time. It's going to take decades, because you can't just overnight, dig a hole and shove carbon dioxide into it. You've got to you've got to identify the right rock formations. You've got to survey the area. In the UK, we'd probably do it offshore. So you've got sort of offshore pipelines to lay and so on. This is a massive, long-term engineering project. It's not going to happen overnight. We can't just carry on planting trees until the space to plant trees runs out and then decide what to do next. We've got to be planning for that now. So what I would really like, and I think a very valuable model for companies to adopt, would be some kind of planned transition. So you say, right, we're going to offset our emissions now, but 1% of our offsets are going to go back underground. And by 2030, for the sake of argument, pick a number out of the air, 10% is fine. I mean, you know, we can have a conversation about that. If you want to be ambitious, make it 30%. That's fine too. But make it by 2030, it's got to be an appreciable percentage of the CO2 you're getting rid of is going back underground, because you've got to accept that by 2050, it may all have to go back underground. So it's just not plausible to be at sort of the 0.1% level until the 2040s, and then suddenly you're going to go 100% geological in the last decade. So that's the kind of thing I think which would, you know, it would drive investment in the right direction. It would assure the technologies. It would give, you know, investors early insight into how much this is all going to cost as well. So, you know, because we don't really know what it's going to cost to get rid of CO2 back underground at that sort of scale. We've got these estimates, but these are from, you know, startup companies who are just doing a few tons here and there. They're not really the kind of cost estimates you need to know what's going to happen when we're doing this on a sort of level of billions of tons per year.
And just to clarify one further point, when we're discussing carbon dioxide emissions, are you also including emissions of other greenhouse gases in that assessment? I think that we've had a few questions around the impact of methane, for example. So could you provide some extra insight on that and those other greenhouse gases?
Sure. So I focused on carbon dioxide. It's the big one. Carbon dioxide is driving up global temperatures at 0.2 degrees per decade. It's responsible for roughly 80% of the warming so far. Other greenhouse gases, of course, have a big impact, but by and large, with the exception of nitrous oxide, which is an important small player but growing, which is long-lived, it accumulates like carbon dioxide, and it's intrinsic to our food system at the moment. But apart from that, all of the other gases pretty much are relatively short-lived. So if we reduce emissions of methane, for example, the warming due to methane falls. Whereas if we reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, it just slows down. It doesn't drop, you know, warming due to carbon dioxide won't stop until we actually reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero. So methane, although it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, in many ways is it's an opportunity rather than you know, as big a problem as carbon dioxide, because if we work on reducing methane emissions, we can cut global temperatures by mid-century by, you know, maybe 0.1 to 0.15 degrees. You may have heard a bigger number coming out of the recent UNEP report, but what they did was they said, well, what if methane emissions carried on going up? And instead we reduced them, and then they took the difference. And so that's how they got to their 0.3 degrees of warming, which was their big headline number. The actual amount by which we could reduce global temperatures by reducing methane emissions is around sort of, you know, 0.1 to 0.15 degrees. And that's if we do everything we can to reduce methane emissions. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide is driving up global temperatures by 0.2 degrees per decade. So that puts it into context. You know, yes, it's helpful, enormously helpful to reduce methane emissions. It can have an impact quite quickly, unlike reducing carbon dioxide emissions. But if you don't reduce carbon dioxide emissions to net zero, then everything else is kind of moot.
And thinking into the longer term, you made the point about some industries being very difficult to decarbonize. I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here, but by promoting the natural and geological storage of carbon, are you not disincentivizing those efforts even further? So the steel company, for example, that might look into hydrogen as a replacement for making steel, might in fact, if they know that offsetting is becoming more of an option, they might actually not invest in that as a technology.
Well, to me, if a steel company disposes of the carbon dioxide generated by its processes, whether it does it by capturing the carbon dioxide when the natural gas comes out of the ground and turning it into hydrogen and making steel that way, or whether it does it by capturing the carbon dioxide at the steel plant, I don't particularly care, provided it captures it and gets rid of it and doesn't dump it in the atmosphere. So I think if we can establish the principle, and if there's one thing I would like somebody to say at COP26 is they get it. They get the principle that if you're going to generate carbon dioxide from fossil sources after mid-century, you're going to have to be ready to put it back underground. You may not have to, we don't need to fix the date, but you've got to have a plan in case the date is as soon as that. And so, for some reason, we're so good at complicating matters. For some reason, people find it very difficult to say this, even though it's such a simple and obvious thing to say. What comes up has to go back down if we're going to keep the whole system stable. So, would this perpetuate, would this give industries a license to continue? Well, I think it should be a condition of them continuing anyway. So, I don't see what to my mind is worse is allowing them to continue without requiring them to dispose of carbon dioxide. The worst, for me, the worst case scenario is that the fossil fuel industry sort of carries on and then is abruptly shut down because climate change is getting so bad. And then we're left with a requirement to dispose of carbon dioxide on a massive scale, which would have to then be done by the taxpayer because we'd have closed the industry down. So, the path we're on just doesn't make any sense. The industry itself, and indeed its customers, which is of course all of us, should be taking care of the problem by starting to dispose of CO2 now so that they can demonstrate how to do it. And they've got the expertise. This is what they do.
Before we perhaps, Myles, go on to talking about industry, you mentioned COP26. What do you think is going to cause governments to actually get it and make more of it? Because I think presumably some push before it can't just be investors who drive companies to commit to carbon capture and storage. When and how does the government push come?
I think first of all, as I say, a simple acknowledgement of reality would be helpful. And it does worry me that our government is much keener to talk about trees and peatlands than it is to talk about this, because of course everybody loves trees, everybody likes peatlands, injecting gases through big pipes underground, that doesn't sound like the sort of thing environmentalists are very fond of. But it's the whole emphasis. So the COP26 as a whole, sort of about a quarter of it is devoted to all this nature-based climate solutions and so on. But it is, as you said, it is distracting people from what's needed for the long-term sustainable solution. So we need that from government. In the end, it will have to be a statutory requirement. If you're going to sell this stuff, you've got to get rid of the CO2. I don't see any other alternative to that. And I also see, the government is, they make a big song and dance to the fact that they're spending 800 million on building carbon dioxide disposal infrastructure in the Northeast. But there seems to be no plan for how it's going to get paid for in the long term. You can't expect the taxpayer, and the same goes for the US. In the US, this stuff is happening, but it's only happening because the taxpayer is paying for it. And for one thing, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see why the taxpayer should have to pay for this. It's still a perfectly profitable industry. Why should we clean up after them? It's also not sustainable because, as we saw with, as we've seen many times in the past, if you rely on taxpayer subsidies, eventually the taxpayer gets pissed off.
And onto oil companies, because that has piqued some interest from some of the attendees. Clearly, they have a really key role here then in sequestering carbon in the long term. Is there a sense at all that this is an opportunity for them, or really is it just a challenge?
I think I can't understand why none of the oil majors has come out and said, please do this, because it gives them a much more predictable future than the future they have at the moment. At the moment, they've got this sort of Damocles hanging over them that they're just never quite sure when climate impacts are going to get so bad that the government will just turn around and say, that's it, you've lost your license. You know, and then they're not able individually to move in this direction because it's expensive. You know, a single company that suddenly started sinking hundreds of millions into carbon dioxide disposal plants would just get bought out because, and its shareholders would rebel because there'd be no obvious benefit to that to the shareholders. What they need is for a level playing field for governments to say, if you're going to sell this stuff, and if anybody else is going to import this stuff, you've got to start disposing of CO2. I mean, I was talking to one of the oil companies shortly after the 1.5 degrees report, and of course I got the question, do you personally think it's in any way possible for us to actually meet the 1.5 degree goal? And I just asked them, well, if you had to decarbonize your product, if it's a licensing condition of continuing to operate, you had to fully decarbonize your product by 2050, would you be able to do so? And they just looked at me like I was crazy. Of course we would. In 30 years? Duh, of course. This industry can do stuff, but it's got to be told to do it.
Mm-hmm. And yes, that's fascinating. And I suppose, would you be able to sort of name those companies that you think are leading the charge at all and have made those, you know, first steps towards this goal? I mean, and which alternatively are really dragging their feet? Okay,
so to be fair, there is an exception. Occidental has, that's a US extractive oil and gas company, have made a net zero commitment, which they're backing up with a real plan. They're lucky in that their business model happens to involve injecting a lot of CO2 back into the Earth's crust anyway. So, it sort of makes sense that they're the first ones to commit in this direction. I was hopeful that Shell and BP were both moving in this direction, and I think they have moved a long way in this direction. They've acknowledged a responsibility to come up with a net zero plan, but their plans have been a little muddied, if I might use the phrase, by the sort of balancing nature-based solutions and geological storage. I think they're very nervous about relying on geological storage because on the one hand it's expensive, and on the other hand they know that people like nature and people don't like stainless steel pipes. So there's a tension there, but there's plenty of people within these companies who absolutely get it, and in fact are quite exasperated with the sort of sudden red herring of all this enthusiasm for nature-based solutions.
And you've already given us a sense of this in some of the comments to earlier questions and in your presentation, but would you be of the view that best way to push for change in the oil in these companies, the oil and gas sector in particular, is to remain invested and engage rather than to disinvest?
Yes, I mean, clearly an investor, ultimately always has to have the option of taking their money out. The investor always has that option. But in my view, if a company is engaged in fossil fuel extraction today and doesn't have a net zero strategy at all, then you've got to ask questions about the management. Maybe you should be divesting just because it's not a very well managed company, and never mind your ESG concerns. And then if a company does have a net zero plan, and many of these companies are starting to produce something that they claim is a net zero strategy, then you need to be interrogating that and asking yourself, does it actually stack up? Is it going to be as cheap as they say it's going to be? This is where, heavy reliance on forest offsets in particular starts to give way, because it becomes clear that the forest offset, not every company can use them. The competition for remaining forest offsets will become so intense that they can no longer rely on them, and they certainly can't rely on them at the costs they're envisaging. So they need to have another plan, and that's where investors, I think, should be probing these companies on is what is the long-term strategy, because it's your money they're looking after.
Well, as many of the attendees on tonight's talk will know, we, McInroy Wood, invest in a number of oil majors, Shell and Total, and we have been probing the Shell's recently published strategy, and indeed will be voting on the 18th. One of the features of that is that we will have the opportunity every year from 2022 to go back and challenge the company on how it has progressed in meeting its commitments. Which Myles, going back to your point, in that strategy, Shell is committing to, by 2035, target carbon storage of 120 million tons per annum. Sorry, that's afforestation, I think, and only 25 million tons through storage. Is that balance right, do you think, looking at that strategy? And is that an area that we should be targeting in our questioning of Shell?
Well, I'd really encourage you to work out the fraction of their total Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions that 25 million tons represents. And ask yourself, given there's a high chance it'll have to be 100% in 2050, is whatever their plan is. I don't know what their projected all scope emissions will be in 2035, so I can't do that sum on the top of my head, but it's not a complicated sum. And that's the curve they've got to be on. And if they're not on it, they don't have a future. So that's the question you need to be asking.
Yes, just following on from that, how much responsibility for scaling up do you think we can expect the publicly owned oil majors to shoulder? And if they do take on the challenge, do you think they will pull the state-owned companies, which are responsible for the majority of production and own the majority of the reserves? Will they bring them along with them?
I think there's a narrowing window for that to happen, because the big danger at the moment is, ironically, investor and activist pressure may make the independent, the publicly owned oil and gas companies just quietly pull out and diversify into renewables, scale down their own upstream extraction activities, and just act as traders of other people's fossil fuels, as just a way of getting out of the whole problem. In which case, increasingly, our fossil fuels will come from completely unaccountable, publicly owned, state-owned companies that will be, probably in many ways much harder to persuade to move in this direction. At the moment, my understanding is that the likes of Gazprom and Saudi Aramco and so on they're actually their policies are actually quite closely tied to the independent oil corporation, because they all, they share technologies. They depend on the IOCs for technical expertise, for joint ventures, and so on. So I think we still have, as long as we have a healthy IOC sector, we still have some leverage over them. And there is always, in the end, we will need regulation. There's no question about that. And that regulation will have to, in the end, apply to internationally traded fossil fuels, not just sort of domestic production. So, if Aramco wants to sell its products in Europe, it's going to have to show where the carbon dioxide's going. That's a regulation that Europe could impose, and just at the point of entry. If you want to bring your, if you want to dock your tanker, you've got to show us your CO2 disposal certificate. And that's, I think, ultimately how you get the leverage.
Yeah. I think one point we and there have been some questions on this that we should address is, again, it's about obligations and how much in achieving net zero should be shared, how you share the obligations between the developed and the developing, and if you have a two-speed and asymmetrical approach, does that create limitations, and does that create additional challenges?
I think what we should be talking about is less the responsibility for reductions or arguments over, how do we share out the remaining carbon space, which are always a bit fruitless, than responsibility for solving the problem. And responsibility for solving the problem undoubtedly rests with the rich world. So we should be getting on with it. We should be decarbonizing the fossil fuels we use as fast as possible. And in doing so, we're going to drive down the cost of that whole process. We're going to work out good and effective ways of capturing carbon dioxide and disposing of it permanently, either back underground or wherever. And so that will make this solution cheaper for developing countries to adopt. In the end, it will have to be a price of participation in international markets. I mean, there's just no option. Any climate regime that works on a single planet has to be global. So developing countries will eventually have to join in, but this is exactly the kind of approach that can be done by developed countries first. There's no risk of us driving industry offshore by imposing an obligation like this, because initially, the implications for the end consumer who might want to, or the steel producer or whatever who might want to move, are actually quite manageable. The cost only really starts to bite when you get into the 2030s and 2040s, when you're going to need to be looking at a global regime anyway.
And Myles, do you sense that the deterioration recently in the evolution of more protectionist geopolitics is creating an environment that makes cooperation on this subject more difficult, or do you think it's an issue that transcends the sort of geopolitics that are playing out at the moment?
Yeah, I think it does show that climate policies cannot depend on universal international cooperation. If you're trying to, and I think we have allowed the best to be the enemy of the good a bit in climate policy. That we want a global agreement, and then so we're waiting for the last country to come on stream. So come on board. The advantage of this approach is that a group of like-minded countries, or companies for that matter, could just start doing it. And it's not going to affect their competitiveness in the short term, because you don't have to dispose of that much carbon dioxide in the short term. You just have to get on with it and show how you're going to increase that fraction over time. And so it sort of naturally lends itself to crowding people in to the solution, unlike many other climate policies where they almost sort of push people out, because as soon as you impose something like a high carbon price in a region, then high carbon emitting industries just quietly move elsewhere.
Well, I'm conscious of the time, Myles, and I might just come in with a slightly unfair curveball question just to finish this off. And this is not really from a denier, but it is a question obviously from someone who's done a lot of research. And they have observed that historically, and we have to go back to the Paleozoic era, I believe, and there were, I think, 10-degree centigrade rises in temperature at some point during that period, while atmospheric carbon was at very much lower levels than it is today. And we've seen a sort of 1.5% rise in temperature. Is there any science to sort of question here? And, is there a sort of, does it undermine any of the correlations that we see between carbon weighting?
Well, first of all, I mean, the basis of prediction that the global warming we're seeing will continue as long as carbon dioxide emissions continue. That doesn't rely on any correlation. That relies on basic physics. We understand this process, and we can see it going on. We can see the impact of rising carbon dioxide concentrations on the radiation being emitted by the planet, where we look down at it from above from satellites. We can see the impact on global temperatures. We can see we can trace where the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has come from through its isotopic signature, through falling oxygen levels. So we can even balance the fact that the carbon dioxide is being generated by burning fossil fuels, so that's absorbing oxygen. So it all adds up to a very robust piece of scientific evidence. The fact that things have happened in Earth's history that we cannot entirely explain, Of course, that will always be the case. But we can explain what's happening at the moment. That explanation makes it very clear that unless we reduce global carbon dioxide emissions to net zero, we won't see the warming stop. I mean, it's very important that, you know, we should keep the conversation going. I'm absolutely not one for shutting down the conversation, but I'm also one for, you know, responding to evidence as it comes in through the door. And the evidence is very clear on this. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s and look at the predictions they made then, you know, Nordhaus's early predictions of the amount of warming we would see as a result of rising CO2, they nailed it. They basically predicted we'd be at 1 degree now, and that's exactly where we are. And the warming continues. So, you know, it turns out to be a relatively simple exercise, working out what carbon dioxide is going to do to global temperatures. So far, the predictions on, you know, multi-decadal timescales have turned out pretty well.
Spot on. Well, in the spirit,
unfortunately, they turned out quite well.
In the spirit of being spot on, Myles, I'm afraid we have raced through the hour, and we'll have to begin to draw proceedings to a close. But that really has been fascinating, and I'm sure I can say that with great confidence on behalf of all those listening in tonight. All eyes will be on Glasgow later this year, and I think we're all much better informed to assess its conclusions and outcomes thanks to your talk and the insight it has given. So on behalf of all of us, thank you, Myles, for your talk and for answering such an array of questions without any hesitation. Thank you all attendees for joining us this evening and for your questions. We would be interested in hearing from you with any comments you may have, and details of how to submit feedback follow. So finally, Myles, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. Good night.